I am your host today at the eLiterate Standard of Proof webinar series. We normally broadcast from the historic Muppet Theater, but today we're lucky enough to have some guest help here from the great technical crew at Macmillan, who also happens to be our special guests for this webinar. So eLiterate readers, welcome, and Macmillan customers and general Macmillan fans, welcome. Let me start by telling you a little bit about the eLiterate Standard of Proof webinars series. We highlight projects, contributions really, made by vendors that help advance our general state of knowledge about improving student success in the sector. So not enough to just for a vendor to be helping their own customers, they have to be helping everyone regardless of whether they are customers. And they have to be doing so in some meaningful collaboration with academics. So the title Standard of Proof refers both to the desire to see some empirical evidence that the contribution is having an impact on student success, as well as a measure of the quality of vendors. We believe at eLiterate that vendors should be judged in part on their contribution to the sector, since education is special. So I'm delighted to be here with Macmillan today. We're going to be hearing about their research framework from Kara McWilliams, Vice President of Learning Science at Macmillan. And we're also joined by two of their academic partners, Thanos Patelis, who you'll find out actually wears several different hats, but I'm going to introduce him as Senior Lecturer at Fordham University. And also a fellow member of Macmillan's Impact Research Advisory Council with me. So I've been very lucky to observe Macmillan's work on student impact up close. And Selena Lindahl, Senior Lecturer at Cal Poly State University. So welcome you all. Today's webinar has a resonance that I didn't actually expect. I'm not sure that anyone could have anticipated as we face down this new coronavirus outbreak. I hope you all are safe at home and that your loved ones are safe and your students and colleagues are safe. But one of the remarkable aspects of what we're experiencing right now is the breathtaking pace at which the science has unfolded. And I follow this all very closely. So what I'm seeing is a lot of pre-publication research that has not yet been peer-reviewed, published outside pay walls, pre-peer review, because we face an urgent challenge. And this is very early research based on limited sample data. And so we're experiencing in real time what it's like to try to make sense out of science as it unfolds based on early data for really consequential topic. And I would argue that we've had that situation for a long time in a variety of areas in our lives. We just haven't been aware of it. And education happens to be one of them. So today I'm delighted that we're going to be talking a little bit about applying data and an sense of empiricism to our work in improving student success, and how we can communicate about it better, especially in the early stages as we're just beginning to get information and beginning to learn, and how we share what we know as soon as we know it without giving people a false sense that we know more or less than we actually do. So I'd like to start this conversation actually with you, Selena. Now, you've participated in Macmillan's early research. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the product that you helped evaluate, and why you got involved, and why you think it's important as a faculty member to take on that sort of work.
Oh, I think you're muted, Selena. How about you try now? Nope.
Oh,
there we go.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And yeah, my name is Selena Lindahl. I've been teaching since 1995, so I feel like I sort of came of age in the era where things were happening pretty rapidly. So you know that this PowerPoint, we started with blackboards, and ironically, we ended up on a platform called Blackboard, completely different, right? But you know, all along the way, we're sort of seeing such rapid change, and so it afforded me this perspective of being less vested in any one technology. So I've sort of just been serially trying new technologies because it just made sense, and all these new technologies hold such promise, and I'm a pretty optimistic person that I, you know, just keep dabbling in them, and so I guess for that reason I'm always game to try the next big thing, and I've used pretty much everything out there, and the thing that I'm testing that I'm beta testing and giving feedback for is Macmillan's product called Achieve. And it does what many of the platforms are doing these days, really is using learning science in an interesting way. And because of my role with the Chancellor's Office and with my Center for Teaching and Learning on campus, where we sort of focus on best practices and try to, you know, in all of our instructor spare time, when we're not researching or doing other things, it's, you know, we're hoping that faculty are interested in learning science as well. So the scholarship of teaching and learning is always been super important to me, and I feel like when publishers take it seriously, that draws me in quite a bit. And Achieve does this thing where it labels not just for faculty like what the learning path is, and it sort of abides by what we know about learning science, but it also labels it for students, which keeps me coming back. I just feel like, yeah, let's see how that plays out for students when they actually get to see how learning works for them. It's not at all what they have come up under. So I guess that's somewhat how I got involved. I've been writing PowerPoints and doing other sort of ancillary work for publishers for a long time. So I'm a natural, I guess, sort of serial experimenter. So does that answer your question? I think I came on board for some of those reasons.
Oh, now Michael, you're muted.
Lots of buttons to push on this platform.
There you go.
So yes, it does answer the question, Selena. I appreciate that. I'd like to drill down just a little bit more. We will talk about Achieve in more detail when Carrie digs into the details of the research itself. But I want to talk a little bit more before we move on to Thanos, Selena, about your calling, because when we spoke the last time, you talked a little bit about your sense of obligation in doing this work. Why do you think it's important for faculty, for teaching faculty, to be engaged in not only trying new things, but the kind of collaborative research that you're working on with Macmillan right now?
Well, I mean, to me, it's such a, I don't want to use this word lightly, but it's such a precious endeavor that we're involved in as instructors in every facet of the educational system, that frankly I get really get really frustrated with instructors that don't take the teaching portion seriously. And so I do feel, I feel like it's an obligation for those of us that are on the side of paying attention to it, to reach out to others, because I don't want to make a coronavirus parallel here that doesn't need to happen, but the sort of like sharing with 2 or 3 instructors each that teach 500 students is massive shift. And I feel as if it's difficult for, so I think most of us would agree to that, but where do we find the resources to do that? And that's where I appreciate when somebody else who has the resources, like a publisher, can get involved and say, all right, we're going to take seriously the work of experimentation and figuring out what works and what doesn't, rather than just selling us the user interview of someone that's only used one product and can say, yeah, I guess it worked pretty well. Doing some more serious research than that to me feels like something that has larger use than just making money for the publisher, for sure.
Great, agreed. So Thanos, you and I have spent some time together looking at the work in progress that we're now seeing the output from today. And your background, you've asked to be introduced as a lecturer, but you are a professional evaluator of research in this field. So could you talk a little bit about both the background that you bring to this work, as well as why you, from your perspective as an educational researcher, you are interested in this kind of collaboration?
Sure. And yeah, I have, currently I'm a senior lecturer at Fordham, as you nicely introduced me, but I've been teaching since 1987 at graduate and undergraduate levels, mostly methods-based courses and substantive courses in psychology. So I love teaching, and the undertaking of learning and helping others learn material that improves, helps them achieve their goals in terms of a career and getting a degree and things like that. So I'm very passionate about supporting the learning of process for adults, but also doing some work and supporting that for K to 12. So I consider education and learning quite important and fundamental to our developing and growing as individuals. And but my training and practical experience has been in 2 fields, right? The program evaluation assessment field that we're sort of been engaged in, participate in ensuring that the goals of a program are met, and we're evaluating and using rigorous methods to help improve and provide information about an initiative or a product, a tech product. So I've been doing that for a while, so really since 1990, both in a K-12 environment and higher ed settings. And then the other area has been my training in as a psychometrician or a measurement expert, building and maintaining the quality of instruments. And you kind of need that in order to have, good science represents having good tools, good instruments. And if we want to achieve our goals of ensuring that certain things are working, we want to make sure that the instrumentation we use are solid, provide truthful and reliable information. So since 90 as well, I've been involved in developing these instruments, and both for large scale and national use, and also for more local regional use. And really those are the means for the sound methods for gathering information to evaluate a program that include using sound measures. Those kind of the 2 factors that I've been involved in for 2.5 decades or so in doing, that really are the means for fueling my passion, my interest in supporting the learning experience of people. So the driver, as you asked, what's driving me to be involved, is ensuring that whatever we expose folks to is working. And we need to do that through sound methodology, sound measurements, so that we can draw some good conclusions and valid conclusions about what's happening to the folks that we're working with.
Okay, so what we have here is we have two passionate educators who have both in their own way gotten involved in different ways and in the research. And Thanos is somebody who is whose field is educational research and has to communicate the subtleties of that to your colleagues, and you're passionate about communicating that to your teaching colleagues. What is hard about that, which is relevant to the challenge that Macmillan is taking on of communicating to its customers about what they know and don't know about a product particularly in its early stages of development? Why is that a hard thing to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And hard translates to time and money when we're talking about this. And the reasons that it makes it hard is that first, you need to engage. If you're an evaluator or researcher, you want to understand the learning process and whether folks are learning and how they're learning and whether the intervention that you're doing, the instructional program that you're introducing, is actually working. The first thing that makes it hard is you need to engage the busy folks who are doing the work. And so the faculty, the teachers, the students, it's hard to engage folks when they're focused in on so many things in their lives. So that makes it hard. And the reason you want to engage them is because you want to make sure you're getting the information clearly in the most unbiased way possible and most authentic way possible, so that you can really truly understand that. So, and this engagement is really hard. I mean, how many marketers have you hung up on, or researchers trying to understand who are you going to vote for? Have you hung up on because you just don't have time? And so, trying to engage folks to get that in is hard. The second thing is, because you're trying to not base your conclusions on anecdote, on just superficial happenstance of events or luck. You're trying to collect data and information in very precise, specific ways that involves a lot of time and effort. And in a sort of the tradition of this empirical scientific approach, we need to collect data not only and information not only of those that are engaged in the program that we're trying to evaluate, but also a comparison group of individuals who are not, or using some kind of control method, almost like what the FDA is kind of doing now, and trying to find that, since you brought it up, the cure for the coronavirus, that injection that will make us immune to it or help improve our well-being. They're trying to do that in a scientifically way, and that involves a lot of time and effort to ensure that the way the intervention is introduced, the data that is collected is the highest quality and truthful, and that it involves clinical trials, if you will, that take a lot of time and effort to convince those to engage in it and also to collect that data. So it's time consuming and it makes it hard.
All right, so that's Kara. Thanos has laid out two pretty daunting challenges, which we'll tackle in reverse order, right? The first one he brought up was, gee, it's really hard just to convey anything with nuance compactly to folks who are busy trying to get on with their day, serve their students, feed their families, get through whatever the crisis of the day happens to be. And then second of all, it's hard to actually get that nuance. And those two things interact with each other, I think, because we don't, a lot of very sophisticated educational practitioners who I would call empirical, by which I mean that they try things, they look for evidence about whether those things are actually helping their students, and they adjust accordingly. They don't naturally think of their work in the classroom as evidence-driven necessarily, even when they're teaching science courses and that's their discipline. So let's talk a little bit, Kara, if you don't mind, about how Macmillan communicates in general and thinks about in general communicating our level of understanding and certainty about anything that we're trying to understand better in this field.
Sure, and Thanos and Selena both brought up really great points. I think that at Macmillan, when we started to think about these challenges, there were sort of two things that we always thought about. When we talk about efficacy in the field, typically efficacy claims are made in one of two ways. One has been sort of what Selena was saying, word of mouth by instructors, colleagues in the department saying, I think this works, it worked for my students. And so there would be this word of mouth that wasn't really based on any sound evidence or reliable or valid claims like Thanos was talking about. And the second way was through these summative statements of impact. And so, 3 or 5 years after a product was in the market, a really rigorous randomized control trial would come out and a claim would be made about half a letter grade improvement or a full letter grade improvement. And those would be sort of the rigorous claims of impact. And there were problems with both of those approaches, but specifically on the efficacy side, the first, Michael, as you alluded to, we would get educators information much too late to make sort of adoption and implementation decisions in their courses. We had already led to false starts and frustrations because there was no real data-driven evidence until they had already decided to start using it. The second, to Thanos's point, is a lot of these studies are conducted in one educational context with one instructor because it's difficult to engage instructors and to engage a representative sample of instructors who all have a lot on their plate. And it's difficult to say, okay, yes, I'm going to pause now and I'm going to participate in a research study with you. But fortunately, there are so many instructors out there like Selena who want to be so evidence-driven and they want to contribute to the field that they're now willing to participate more in these types of studies. The challenge, though, is that those aren't the only educators that we want participating in our studies. We want a nice, full representative sample. So that was one of the challenges that we needed to overcome. But, we have really great partners who have worked with us. And then the last thing is that, again, to Thanos's point, the student is so important in this case. For so long, we have just sort of lumped all of the students in a class together and made claims about the impact on those students, rather than really taking the time to go through the appropriate IRB approvals and to get the active informed consents from all of the students and collect the information that we need on those students so that we can disaggregate them into subgroups and understand what I like to refer to as the differential efficacy of a tool to see if the magnitude of the relationship between use and outcomes is different for different groups of students. So when thinking about all of those things, Macmillan Learning worked with Thanos and Michael and the other folks on the Impact Research Advisory Council and worked with the partner instructors that we engage with for research, and we developed a framework for how we believe that educational technology can be evaluated to understand if it's working, who it works for, and in what context. And if it's okay, I'd like to just share that on the screen now, Michael.
Please.
So just let me know if you can see that framework.
It's showing for me.
Great. So what you're looking at here is the framework that Macmillan Learning adopted with the support of the impact research, our academic experts, and our partner instructors. What we hope that this framework enables for the field is, it's not specific to Macmillan Learning's tools. It's specific to any type of educational technology. So this framework can be used by any vendor who is developing a digital learning tool to help sort of set the framework for the evidence that they want to collect starting in development all the way through when the tool is in market. but it can also be used by administrators or educators or parents or students or anyone who's thinking about adopting a digital learning tool. They can look at this framework and understand whether the vendor that they're evaluating or the tool that they're evaluating has each of these pieces of evidence, or the pieces of evidence that matter the most to them. In some cases, educators care more about one of these verticals than another one, and we wanted to make sure that they were individual enough that folks could look at the information that mattered the most to them and understand the claims that could be made. So I'll just quickly walk through sort of how we think about this framework.
Mm-hmm.
When we start early in a tool's development, it's important to understand whether the tool is built on learning science principles. And the publisher or the vendor or the provider needs to make that information available to the general public. Not just say, here are a list of citations that we looked at to understand the research before we built the tool. It's important to be able to say, like the example Selena gave, where Macmillan Learning has pre, in, or post class. We have an active learning model that we share, that we publish under Creative Commons, and we share to help folks understand the learning science beneath our products. And then secondly, was the tool developed in partnership with instructors and students? Vendors and product developers can be so far removed from the classroom that unless we really partner, in the same rooms, conducting workshops with instructors and with their students and with a representative sample of both, that's how you really, develop the empathy for the end user of the tool, and that's how you really apply human-centered design to a product's development. So that partnership at the early stages is really important. As we move to later stage development and optimization, we think it's really important that implementation patterns are researched and documented. As educational technology becomes more comprehensive and can be used in so many different ways, one of the key tenets of an effective tool is that it's flexible enough to enhance an instructor's pedagogy, whatever that might be. And so we want to make sure that we understand how educators are using those tools, because those use cases are going to be heavily related to the outcomes. And in addition to that, those implementation patterns can help us support teaching and learning, because we might say to an educator, well, look at all of this research that was done in this implementation pattern in an educational context like yours. You might try implementing these different features or these different capabilities. And we wouldn't be able to have that impact on teaching and learning if we didn't look at those implementation patterns. Then, as I said, we want to make sure that effectiveness is measured within context and student cohort. One of my favorite stories from my early days of researching educational technology is when I was talking to an instructor and I said, you should really try to use the tool this way. Look at this great research study that was conducted and these great outcomes. And she said to me, I teach at a 2-year open enrollment institution, and this research was done at a highly selective, small 4-year institution. And while the research is rigorous, it doesn't really apply to my students or to my educational context. And she couldn't have been more right. So we think it's important to capture that information about the educational context, partner with instructors across those different contexts, capture the data needed to look at different student cohorts, and look at evidence within those different groups. Then, especially when you're thinking about tools that are early in development, once a tool has been optimized based on the feedback that you've gotten in those early studies, you want to replicate those results. Because early stage, it's likely that the educators that are partnering with you might be more tolerant to technology, might be more open to different, changes in their classroom or doing things a different way. You want to try to expand that sample so that it's replicated among a more generalizable population, all types of instructors, all types of students, to understand if there are any differences. And then finally, once you understand how a tool is being used, once you have that evidence of effectiveness or correlational evidence within context, within cohort, like Thanos said, it's incredibly important that you then can make valid causal claims of impact, where you're actually comparing use of the tool with non-use of the tool and something else. And when you have those causal claims, it's important to look at those outcomes within implementation model, so that you're able to look back to the early research you did and say, when a tool is used this way, these are the claims of impact that we can have. So that's a really high-level view, Michael, at the framework that we have developed in partnership with our experts and our instructors that help us understand the evidence that we think will help administrators and educators make decisions. And as I said, we hope that this framework will be used more broadly and not just for Macmillan's tools, though hopefully later in the hour we'll be able to show you how we've applied it to achieve.
Thank you, Kara. So I really want to emphasize that this approach is a contribution, right? As Kara was just saying, you can use it with researching any product. And so what we're going to see in the second half of the hour is the application of that contribution to Macmillan's own work, and how that, hopefully for you and for the market, increases your confidence that the product that you're getting is well designed, is well tested, keeping both the what we know in general about science in mind, as well as what we know about you and your teaching circumstances and your students in mind. So before we move on to that though, Kara, I want to turn back to Thanos and Selena first. Thanos, as a researcher practitioner who's interested in communicating what you know about the efficacy of a product to your colleagues, how does this framework resonate with you?
The framework is fundamental to the evaluation process, to the process of evaluating it with sound evidence. The manner in which it's communicated was obviously clearly done by Kara as a proponent, as sort of a contributor to, I mean, because of her expertise and wisdom, she was able to introduce this to Macmillan Learning, which is also, as you indicated, a contribution to the field. But it is fundamental, right, to the how a program evaluation happens. But what, unfortunately, in many evaluation efforts, small and large scales, the nuance of what this process represents is lost. In fact, the U.S. Department of Education has invested a huge amount of resources for providing a clearinghouse of scientifically based efficacy studies, most of it in the K-12 area, and what's called the What Works Clearinghouse. And what they found is not many people use it. And when they did some inquiry as to, well, why aren't people using it? It's free, it's out there. And there are really two fundamental reasons. And the primary reason is that people aren't, the information conveyed is not accessible in a user-friendly manner that really resonates with, well, I just want to do the right thing, and I'm not understanding the nuances and the technology of the terminology used for me to use it in my practice. And so there's now the new director of the IES program. I've heard him speak at a number of different places, indicating that they're investing funds to translate the results of that information to something that is usable in the field. So that's what you heard from Kara is atypical of what the field has done in terms of the clarity of the communication of the framework and the process that one goes through in collecting this evidence. So I don't know if that's what you were asking me to elaborate on, but it is it falls short, unfortunately, in the mainstream.
No, spot on. What the essence of what I just heard from you is that communicating clearly about what we know and how we know it has an enormous impact on on the degree to which effective practices get looked at, never mind adopted. So Selena, as a practitioner who is an expert in your discipline and a believer in learning about more effective teaching and an evangelist to your colleague, how does this framework scan to you?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I would echo Thanos and say that it's pretty fundamental. I happen to be part of a discipline that's, I don't think this is true everywhere, but economists are fairly cynical, fairly, doing a lot of our own research. So anything that looks less than peer-reviewed, well-designed research is going to be sort of just forgotten about or not even paid attention to in the first place. So so for me, this is approaching the sort of respectability that I think the more old school instructors sometimes find it easy to not work on their teaching, let's just say, because but what you mentioned already, Thanos, was about sort of the language barrier, right? Of not even understanding what a flipped classroom is, or what the different forms of active learning, or low stakes, high stakes, summative, formative assessment. These are sort of like, barriers. So building a bridge to understand that and sort of help us to make sense, help us that have never had any training in teaching and learning, don't know much about the learning science, help us to come to grips with it is invaluable. And I find that the framework for me, and for what I believe my colleagues might be dragging their feet about, does a lot of work to sort of to building a bridge and breaking down both the negative interpretation of any publisher research or research about teaching and learning in general. It raises the respectability, but then it also does the work, which I think is maybe even more important, which is just tagging things, like giving a layperson's sort of perspective on education, so that the language barrier is in decline, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there are probably a number of items that Kara listed off casually in terms of things that Macmillan has to think about that most educators aren't aware of as issues for curricular materials designers. But then once you hear them, they make sense. It's not that this is beyond the capacity of the average PhD to understand. It's just that we haven't framed it for them in a way that is accessible to them in the time they have and the framework that they have, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So Kara, we spend a lot of time on the setup of this, high percentage of our hour together, because I think it's really important for folks to understand that there's a certain, if a tree falls in the forest kind of aspect about educational research. And now that we've talked through how you approach this framework and how you use it, not only to make sure that you're touching all the bases internally in terms of doing responsible research. There are a whole bunch of topics that we're not going to get to today that maybe we'll do in a follow-up webinar at some point, such as IRB communication, that is working with academic bodies that oversee human subjects research. Because when you're researching, for those of you who are not involved in educational research, when you are researching a product that impacts your students' learnings, you are in fact doing human subjects research. And that in an academic institution falls under some of the same guidelines and review requirements interinstitutionally as, say, you know, a study of a cardiac intervention or a psychological intervention. So lots and lots to talk about, right? This is what we're given is a way in, and now, Kara, what I'd like to do is move a little bit faster um, now that we have this set up, and give you an opportunity to really dig into the case study that is Achieve, and talk a little bit, give us just a high-level overview of what Achieve is, and then dive into how your research went and what you all did and how that project is going for you.
Sure. So I'll just share my screen again. So to give a really brief background on Achieve, Achieve is a next generation learning platform that is developed what we call for the whole student, where it is in a tool that offers pre-class activities, in-class activities to increase active learning and engagement, and post-class activities. It includes an assessment system, so it's not just a homework system. We really think it's important to have cognitive and non-cognitive assessments that enable insights for instructors through dashboard reports. And so really Achieve is meant to support the whole student. In order to, sorry, go ahead.
No, I apologize for interrupting. I just realized I should have said much earlier in the webinar. Please, attendees, if you have some questions for any of the panelists, please put them in the chat window. And as we get into the meat of Kara's presentation, I suspect you will have some questions. So please go right ahead and ask. Sorry, please continue, Kara.
No worries. So in order to evaluate such a comprehensive tool like Achieve, it's really important for us to implement that framework that we went over. What you can see here is how we have applied the framework, the efficacy framework, to Achieve. What we're trying to communicate here are a couple of things. One, like we've been talking about, that we conduct rigorous research that meets the standards of the type of study that we're conducting at that time. Two, that the claims that we can make are appropriate based on the evidence we have, given the data that we've collected at that time. And then thirdly, we want to communicate it in a way that is easily consumable, and it's practical and actionable, and there is an increased utility in the research. It doesn't just sit on a shelf somewhere. It can really be used for adoption and implementation decisions. We also, on top of all of that, we want to be really transparent, and I welcome you to look at a recent Inside Higher Ed article that was written on our approach to efficacy, where the author really focused on this idea of transparency. We don't just publish the positive results of our tools, we publish all of the results of our tools. And we know that by being transparent and pulling the curtain back early in testing, some of the results aren't going to be as positive as we want them to be, but we think it's all part of building that trust between the vendors and the educators and the administrators who are going to be using these tools. So what you can see here is how we've placed a red dot next to each of the pieces of evidence that we have collected for Achieve. And we have claims that we can confidently make about each of those pieces of evidence. You'll see that there are some white dots. That's because we are currently in our last semester of beta testing, and in this semester is when we're conducting that quasi-experimental trial or that comparison group. So we can't yet make those claims that are in white, but we hope to be able to make them at the end of the semester. Again, what this means to do is for an instructor to go to our website and look across our framework and see the information that's important to them and understand what we can say now, what we hope to be able to say, and when we hope to be able to say it. On the website, each of the headings on these columns are clickable. So if an educator or an administrator is really interested in implementation patterns, or how we have evaluated implementation patterns, or how instructors are using our tools, they can click on that header and it will bring them directly to the report where the evidence is aligned to the information that's inside of that column. Again, we're trying to make it really easy for educators or parents or students or anyone who's interested to be able to access that information in a consumable way. So just to give you some examples of what we've been looking at, all the way on the left-hand side here, you see that in the summer of 2017 through the fall of 2018, our learning research team spent a great deal of time working with product developers and engineers and educators and students to create the learning model and the learning science principles that would underpin Achieve. As I said, we've published all of them under Creative Commons, so they're all publicly available, both for educators to understand how Achieve is being used, but also so that the field can benefit like we hope it benefits from this framework. We want it to be used more broadly. We also engaged with hundreds of students and hundreds of instructors to sort of understand the personas behind the folks who would be using our tools, to make sure that we were designing a tool that would support all students and the whole student. And I think the work that we have done there has recently been recognized. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar, but Digital Promise recently created a research-based design product certification, where the tool and all of the publicly available information about the learning science that's built into the tool goes through a rigorous external evaluation by the Digital Promise team, and they evaluate whether there is the evidence that the tool is built on the learning science principles, and the Achieve tool recently received that recognition from Digital Promise, which is just another piece of evidence to help educators understand this is a tool that we expect will work for their students. Then, when we moved into spring of 2019, we partnered with 60 instructors and their students. During that time, Thanos made a really good point that it's difficult to create the instruments and collect the data that you need to be able to make the claims that you're hoping to make. And so we had a really rigorous longitudinal data collection process, which Selena, I'm sure, can speak to because she's gone through it a number of times. But we collect baseline surveys from instructors and students after students have actively informed consent to give us information about their background, demographic, experience with digital technology, experience in education. We collect implementation logs from instructors. So every week we ask them to do sort of a diary study to help us understand how they used Achieve that week, why they used it that way. The researchers visit the campuses and sit in on the classrooms, and they observe Achieve being used. They conduct focus groups with students, on-site interviews with instructors. At the end of the semester, we collect post surveys that we match to the baseline surveys. We also extract the platform data to understand empirical implementation and usage patterns. And for consenting students, instructors share their classroom records with us. So their participation grades, their engagement grades, their final course grades, their exam grades, any grade that an instructor has collected, they share with us. So we can match all of those data together and have a more comprehensive view of how instructors have used the tools, how students have engaged, and the outcomes they have received. We look at the relationship between use and outcome within implementation pattern. You can see the correlation on top of the chart, but then we also are able to do things like disaggregate the data between students more and less academically prepared to succeed. So we can understand if it's only sort of the much more academically prepared students who are benefiting from this tool, and to understand, if we're keeping them challenged and also supporting the less academically prepared students. We also want to look at things like, did our self-regulated learning tools support students who are first-generation students? Really, those subgroups that instructors ask us about all of the time, we want to be able to answer those specific questions. Then in the fall of 2019, we replicated that study with a more representative sample of instructors. Again, like I said, those who are less tolerant of technology, who are more skeptical about whether technology could support students in the classroom. And we were able to replicate the results that we had found the semester before. And then, as I said, this semester, we have 51 instructors who are participating in a study where they are either using Achieve in one section and not in another section, or they have partnered with an instructor in their department who is teaching the same course. And we are looking at the perceptions and the student perceptions and the learning outcomes, comparing them between those two groups. We've just recently passed the midterm of the semester, and with the early midterm perception results, we're finding that instructors who are using Achieve feel that that tool supports mastery of learning more, supports student engagement and active learning more than other tools that are being used, which are really exciting directional findings, but it won't be until the end of this semester that we'll really be able to fill in the rest of those dots and be able to hopefully make those claims about the impact of Achieve within discipline and within implementation patterns, educational contexts. And then quickly, I'll just say, Michael, that in an effort to communicate these findings in a way that is rigorous but also reliable, we have three outlets with which we use to communicate the results. The first are the technical reports that Michael and Thanos are really familiar with, because these are the really large comprehensive reports that we ask our Impact Research Advisory Council to review, and they use a rubric to rate the study and rate the report and rate the claims that we're making and provide us feedback on each of the areas that we ask them to evaluate of the report. If we haven't reached a 3, which is the highest rating, we ask for feedback on how we can get to a 3, and the team sort of revises it as you would do a revise and resubmit for a journal publication, for example. And we work to make sure that we feel that the Impact Research Advisory Council feels that those technical reports are ready for Macmillan Learning publications. That allows us to get peer-reviewed information in the hands of administrators and educators more quickly than it would if we went through the whole journal acceptance process. And in that way, giving them the information they need before they make important decisions like adoption and implementation. Then, a step down from that are the research reports. These are derived from the peer-reviewed analyses. So these reports aren't all peer-reviewed, but they are derived from what we did in the large technical reports, just disaggregated by different disciplines. For example, what you're seeing here is the calculus report that has been disaggregated from the larger report across 5 disciplines. But it's a specific research focus or a specific discipline focus. Some of our research reports focus, like I said, on first-generation students or on closing the academic gap between more and less academically prepared students. And then lastly, our educator studies. These are brief 4-page studies that are representative of one partnership with one of the instructors in our more comprehensive sample of 60 or so instructors. These really focus on the context, the educational context of that instructor, the challenges she was facing, what she was trying to accomplish in her classroom, how she chose to implement, achieve the specific implementation pattern, then the outcomes that were realized in that class specifically. And then these highlight a box which we call insights for educators, because we want an educator who can pick up this educator study and say, you know what, I teach Calc 1 in a large 4-year classroom. I want to understand what some of the implications were from this study. And it provides suggestions for different ways of implementation. It also provides the feedback that instructor gave to Macmillan to optimize the tool. You know, like I said, we want to be really transparent, and we speak to whether that feedback has been implemented in Achieve since the study took place, so that we're clear that, you know, in the age of Agile, these tools are always in development and we're never done building Achieve. We're continually going to be optimizing based on the feedback that we're getting from instructors. So these are the 3 ways that we try to appeal to anyone who wants to understand the research, regardless of sort of their level of understanding of the technical detail, or if they're more interested in sort of the specific implementation in that context. So Michael, did that help sort of give a high-level view of how we approach it and communicate it as it relates to Achieve?
Absolutely, and it brings up a critical point that's central to the whole premise of Standard of Proof webinar series, which is that you should, as you evaluate different products from different vendors in the context of what you want to do with your students, you should be able to make informed decisions based on a variety of kinds of information and formats of information that the vendor makes available to you. If this were a conventional 1-hour webinar on Achieve's research, we would have spent the whole hour talking about the charts and graphs that Kara just gestured to in the last 5 minutes. And it's important to spend every moment you can and every channel you can talking about the evidence. But it's also important to know that most folks don't have an hour to spend on a webinar going through all of that. So we need our own sources of information where we can evaluate whether the vendor is doing a good job for us. And hopefully what Kara's just given you now is the place that you go next, the information sources that you go to next. And what we've given you in the last hour is a sense of how to read those information sources. Standard of Proof is about showing for you just how much work there is involved in doing the job right of being a supportive, evidence-based vendor who works collaboratively with educators, and modeling the conversations that you can have with the vendors and the questions that you can and should be asking in order to determine whether these are vendors that are doing the right thing and therefore ones that you should privilege in your selection process. So that was a perfect way to wrap up. We could easily spend another hour or two digging into these topics, but I hope you all have gotten a good sense of what Macmillan is trying to, pardon the pun, but achieve here. You will be receiving a follow-up email with the link to the archive of this video, of this webinar, so you can share it to your colleagues. It will be up on YouTube. It's not going to be behind any kind of pay registration wall, because we believe in these webinars as contributions to the community in and of themselves. If you registered through the Macmillan website, you will not be getting spam from eLiterate about future webinars unless you opt in. So we will be following up with you if you're interested in future webinars from Standard of Proof, in how you can choose to actively opt in, which we have touched on several times today, that active informed consent is important. I will briefly put in a shameless plug that we have another webinar at this time next week with Titan Partners on what they've learned in their study about how campuses need to collaborate across departments in order to improve student success. Hope to see you there. Happy to see you here. Happy to have had an opportunity to speak with our great panelists today, and to highlight some of the great work that I've been privileged to watch unfold at Macmillan. Thank you all, and stay healthy.
Thank you for the opportunity, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks.